Thank you very much, Veena, for that generous introduction, and very, very glad to be here today and to hear from so many incredible speakers. I'm going to be presenting right now with a sort of PowerPoint slideshow that takes us to two stories, right? So the first story is going to be the history of the Indian queer movement and the sort of spaces through which this battle has been fought. And the second part is going to be this complicated question of identity and what do we do between Indian and Western identities, and can we really separate the two? So if we go to the first slide, I'm going to start my story with the one act that all of us know, the one where every queer conversation starts, which is section 377, right? I want to start with 377, not because I want to put it forth as the most important moment in Indian queer history, but to rather dismantle that idea of 377 being the only fight. Now, for a lot of you who are here, many of you who made these arguments as well, and many of us who've been part of the protests leading up to the various verdicts of Section 377, you know that a large component of the argument that was made in the fight against 377 was that the imposition of homophobia in India was a result of colonialism. So this poster is one that became quite famous, which is 377 Quit India. Queer Azadi became a popular nara. It said that sort of 377 was an imposition of Victorian morality. And the larger consensus was that there was an acceptance for queer people in India before colonization. If we go to the next slide, a lot of the examples used to sort of support such an assertion were examples from Indian history, which is from places like Khajuraho and the Kama Sutra, and then also from other monuments like the Jamali Kamali monument. Sorry, can we just go to the next slide? Because I do not have control over it. The one right before this. Yes. The reason for this was also, of course, because, and if we go to the one before this one, where there is a photo of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who introduced Section 377, the reason for this was that we had colonial administrators like Macaulay bringing in laws like 377 into the public domain and introducing for the first time laws against queerness in the country. Let's also remember that 377 was not the only law criminalizing queer people. There was also the Criminal Tribes Act, which was introduced by the British, which explicitly criminalized trans persons, not for any sexual act, not for anything that involved an act committed in the private sphere, but for existing as a category. So a trans person could be arrested simply for being trans, regardless of whether they did anything or not. Now, just two slides after this, please. A lot of this explanation of what has happened with Indian history and Indian queerness has been elucidated in a seminal work, Same-Sex Love in India by Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, and has been built upon by more contemporary mythologists like Devdutt Patnaik in tales like Shikhandi. So the picture that has been drawn is that before colonization, there was a wide diversity of queer identities that got sort of compressed and stigmatized under a single category of queer or gay or homosexual under British colonization. However, this is an argument that's been argued, that this is an argument that has been resisted as well by several people. If we go to the next slide, there's an influential book that comes out very early in the queer movement, which is called A Lotus of Another Color, edited by Rakesh Ratti, in which there's a beautiful essay by Nayan Shah, who says that why should we need history to prove the existence of people in the present? And why should we need a return to history to say that queer people who exist here and now deserve rights? And he anticipated many of the challenges that come with the use of history, which involve interpretation of history that can make such understandings problematic, right? Another work by Maya Sharma, which is Loving Women, Being Lesbian, Unprivileged India, removes the idea of queerness from just the idea of religion and says that, in fact, queerness is a practice that is rooted in culture rather than religion. And the acceptance for queerness is not uniform. And the acceptance and understanding of what queerness means is also not uniform. So Maya traces a lot of narratives around women in rural Gujarat in particular to show us how across time, various communities have responded to queerness differently, setting this agenda that yes, British colonization did bring in a certain form of homophobia, but that is not to say that before British colonization, everything was hunky dory. This is something that has been built on by the feminist and Dalit movements as well, who said, well, if you're saying that queerness was okay before colonization, we know that caste was still a problem. We know that patriarchy was still a problem. So, what happens to Dalit queers? What happens to queer women? Do they also enjoy that same right? And do the representations that we see of the acceptance of queerness extend to other marginalized communities against whom there were restrictions, against whom there was discrimination, even before colonization? If we go to the next slide, there is another sort of debate that comes through, which is that outside these structures, before we come up with this argument of the British bringing in homophobia, we have strong responses to two important works. And I think Shubha mentioned these earlier. One is Ismat Chughta's Liha, which is written in the 1940s, in which you have a story that implicates some queer love without explicitly stating it, which gets a lot of backlash. And then you have Deepa Mehta's Fire, which is again released in 1996, that sees the sort of shutting down of movie theaters because lesbian love is not Indian, it's a corruption of Indian values. In the middle of all of this, several responses get generated towards this question of how do we tackle the homophobia that exists. If we go to the next slide, we see that one of the earliest responses to fighting homophobia actually comes from the anti-caste movement. So this is a picture of Namdev Dhasal. Dhasal was one of the leaders of the Dalit Panthers in Bombay. And at that time, he was one of the first people to lead a morcha of sex workers and trans people to demand ration cards and to demand identity sort of proof at a time when these communities were explicitly left out of the public distribution system. It's something that comes back now, right, in the times of a pandemic, where for so many trans people across the country, access to food relief and official food relief was denied because their names or their sort of gender presentation did not match their identity proof or their identity documentation. Another form of resistance that came through in the sort of, and if you go to the next slide, to this wave of homophobia was the introduction of a fresh wave of homophobia that came with the AIDS crisis, right? The picture on the left is actually from New York City in the early 1970s, and of the sort of incredible pain and anger and death and destruction wrought about by AIDS. And the fact that it transfers, right? It moves continents, that AIDS becomes a global pandemic. It becomes one of the earliest pandemics that leads to a lot of discrimination and stigmatization. On the right is actually one of the first AIDS rallies that's held in India, um, with the red ribbon, of course. And in the AIDS movement, you see a solidarity between feminist groups and between LGBT groups. And this creation of a queer feminist solidarity, which leads to a renewed push for destigmatization of homosexuality. You also see the formation of groups like ABVA, the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan, which is one of the first organizations that leads the petition against 377 in the courts. The next petition that comes is also led by another AIDS control organization, NAS Foundation, which is the same petition that moves its way to the Delhi High Court, right? Now, we all know, and many of us know the story of this petition, which is that 2001, this petition gets filed in the Delhi High Court. It goes through a lot of legal ups and downs. In 2009, the Delhi High Court allows the decriminalization of any sexual activity that is against the order of nature as defined by the law in private. And it's a verdict that gets turned around by the Supreme Court in 2013, only to again be flip-flopped back in 2018, right? So if we go to 2018 to the next slide, we see this powerful quote by the Supreme Court of India, which says that consensual sex between adults in a private space, which is not harmful to women or children, cannot be denied, as it is a matter of individual choice. Section 377 results in discrimination and is violative of constitutional principles. So now, three things that I want to draw out here, right? One is, what is the argument that we make when we talk of queer rights? One of the arguments made is that the British introduced a form of homophobia that erased original queer identities or indigenous queer identities, right? And it led to systematic homophobia. That's complicated in parts by authors who pointed out that not everything was hunky-dory before the British came in. It was simply different. At some time periods in history, queerness had more acceptance. At other time periods, it has less acceptance. As a historian, a lot of my work focuses on these shifts, right? We cannot assume that 4,000, 5,000 years of history before 200 years of colonization were uniform. It goes through the same ups and downs as any historical process does. And the third thing is that what are the ways in which this homophobia has been resisted once this organized homophobia has come in? And they are through anti-caste resistance, that is through feminist resistance, and then it is through the letter of the law and through this abiding to constitutional principles. Now, I want to move on to the next section, which is what do we do now that we've established that colonialism got with it, this sort of discrimination on the basis of sexuality as sexual act, and it made it codified in law and therefore organized a systematic persecution of LGBT people. What happens to the identities that existed before colonization? And what happens to the identities created after colonization, right? So if we go to the next slide, one of the seminal thinkers on this idea of sexuality and how it gets modified is Michel Foucault. What Foucault says in his History of Sexuality is that in the 19th century, through medical discourse, we see the creation of the category of the homosexual. Now, let's be clear, right? It's not saying that people were not having queer relationships before the 19th century, but in the 19th century, we see this medical terminology of the homosexual, which is used then in legal frameworks, in popular discourse to discriminate against queer people. So the category of the homosexual is created in the 19th century as a medical discourse that erases all the identities that came up before it across the world. And as a result of colonization, it gets exported to across the world and therefore subsumes these categories and creates this new idea of a queer person as being inherently different because of the sexual acts they participate in. Now, what does that mean in the Indian context, right? It means that today, for many people, the fact of colonization and the fact that we do have a period in which we were colonized and the fact of the creation of the homosexual has led to the importing, or rather the co-creation of these identities in the Indian context. So with processes of globalization, with the fact that the world is soon now starting to speak in a single language in some ways, we do have people in India who identify as LGBTQ, right? There is a way, for instance, I identify as a gay man. For me, the vocabulary of gay is what best describes my identity. And it's a vocabulary that is the result of colonization, is the result of medical processes, but it's also the result of my own interpretations of what it means to be gay. And so gayness in the Indian context is not just a foreign concept or a foreign import, but it is a sort of process that gets created, modified, adapted, and owned by queer people. And why should we have this problem with this being a concept? And I argue that we shouldn't, because in many ways, a lot of the other concepts that we live with are also concepts that we've modified, adapted, and worked with. The concept of the nation, for instance, right? There was no concept of a country or a nation or an institution of government called democracy or the idea of a prime minister before the forces of colonization and imperialism. What we've done is we've taken them, we've adapted them, and we've built upon them in some ways. So we must understand culture and identity as a constant process of co-creation. If we just go to the next slide, if we and the one after this, please. So if we understand this as a process of co-creation, then what we see is, and which is something you'll view at most prides across the country today, the coexistence of these identities together in the Indian context, right? So we have people who identify as gay, we also have people who identify as Koti. We have people who identify as lesbian, we also have people who identify as Hijra. Now, all of these identities have been transforming over the years and continue to transform as we speak. And they exist in a larger spectrum of gender and sexuality in India than they do in other places. Now, that leads to a lot of conflicts, that leads to a lot of difficulties in categorization. That means, how do you create a policy, or how do you create understandings of sensitization that exist across the board? How do you not sort of create a form of respectability politics that says just because there are queer and trans people who engage in sex work or who engage in begging, that they should be treated differently? How do you sort of ensure that concepts such as pronouns translate across the board into indigenous identities as well, and identities outside LGBTQ plus spectrums? But what it also does, it does is it gives the possibilities for greater solidarity. So if we go to the next slide, um, it leads to ways in which several of these identities come together in common fights as well. So the fight against the Trans Act is a great example. The Trans Act affects all trans persons, including those who identify as Hijra, including those who identify as trans men or trans women outside of the Hijra system, including sort of intersex, gender non-binary, gender fluid persons, because they are implicated within the act and the language of the act as well. And it sort of provides a place in which we can come together and rethink our solidarities and come behind a common fight, because we know that we're stronger together. And if each of our communities gets separated, then our collective voice and our ability to resist also becomes much weaker. And so how do we think of queerness as a general broad category containing within it several identities that must ally with each other in a similar way to which straight people need to ally with queer people, right? Or cis people need to ally with queer people. So within queerness, there's a multitude of identities presenting some possibilities and some challenges, but also presenting new futures and new sort of avenues for collaboration, cooperation, learning, and loving. The final slide that I want to go to elaborate on this is the incredible way in which the queer community as a whole came together during the pandemic, right? Separated by several identity markers, separated by different versions of Hijra and Koti and gay and lesbian, urban and rural, we saw an outpouring of support for queer and trans fundraisers for food and medical relief in the middle of the pandemic. This is a photo of Grace Banu, who was doing a lot of work in Thoothukudi in Tamil Nadu. And Grace sort of led a fundraiser on multiple platforms that saw queer people, not just from India, but across the world, contribute, right? And saw this incredible creation of solidarities, this incredible space of possibilities that said, yes, we should not ignore the fact that we are different, but that cannot and should not stop us from imagining a possibility when we can support each other, learn from each other, and come together on a shared bedrock of experience.